Well, thank you so much, Congressman Khanna, for making the time to join this webinar. And I also want to extend our appreciation for everything that you have done to ensure that VC-backed startups do qualify for the PPP, et cetera. I know that Senator Pelosi and you have been working on that, and so we do appreciate that. And what I'd like us to do is perhaps start with you giving us an overview of what these programs are. I know we have the Economic Injury Disaster Relief Loan, we have the Paycheck Protection program, as well as the SBA loan. So if you could give us a high-level overview, that would be useful, and then we could dive into specific questions that our viewers have sent in.
Well, thank you, B.J. Thank you for your leadership with TiE. It's such a critical moment and your outreach to so many entrepreneurs and startups. And I appreciate your inviting me to share my perspective with so many incredible entrepreneurs and startups that are at the core of what makes Silicon Valley so exceptional. I appreciate your recognition of our push to get VC-backed startups to qualify for the Paycheck Protection Program. It's not perfect yet. They still haven't given a bright line rule, but it's much better, the guidance that they have issued, saying that if a VC is less than 50% and is unable to block a board decision or control a quorum, then the startup can qualify. And we've heard many startups now getting those loans and qualifying because they don't have a dominant VC backing them. And so we have made progress. You alluded to the main programs. The Paycheck Protection Program is the most significant one. It's being administered by the banks. And if you can show that you're basically have been hit by COVID-19 and you're going to use the money to either pay rent or utilities or keep people employed who otherwise would have been laid off, then you qualify for the Paycheck Protection Program. It's an 8-week loan for payroll and basic expenses, but it's forgiven at the end if you can show that that money was used to keep people employed or keep the business running. The other loans that you alluded to, the emergency injury loan and the SBA loans, also are loans that could be forgiven in part if you're able to show that the portion of that loan went to keeping people employed or went to keeping the business running. You can't use that money to acquire a new technology or to expand and expect that it be forgiven. Then you'll have to repay that portion. But anything that you're doing to retain payroll can then convert to a grant, and that determination will be made in 4 or 5 months when the loan actually becomes due. Right now, the SBA is too swamped to do something like that. So those are the main programs that people have asked, well, how do I show that I've actually been affected? And all of this is based on good faith. So if you make a good faith certification that COVID has hurt your business, that it's hurt your revenue, that it's hurt your ability to keep payroll, then you can qualify for these loans. Obviously, if there's not good faith, then there could be liability or concern. But the key here is there a good faith argument?
Great. Thank you so much for that overview, Congressman Khanna. Now let's dive into the questions. We have tons of questions which have already been submitted and more coming in real time. So one of the concerns that entrepreneurs have is that we know that the banks are definitely going to be oversubscribed, right? We saw that with some of the larger banks like Wells Fargo, et cetera, where they maxed out pretty quickly. One of the concerns is Congress going to take care of these entrepreneurs with additional funding, or once these monies run out, are we out?
We are going to be funding additionally. There's right now, as you may have seen from the news, debate going on about extending it $250 billion, the program. Democrats are supporting that, but there's disagreement on other parts. Democrats want also more money for cities and states and for hospitals. But I anticipate over the next week or so that will be resolved. And I've been pushing to make sure that not just traditional banks, but alternative lenders it can also partake in this programs. So some of the tech lenders and should be able to be involved in getting these loans out. I understand the frustration. I mean, sometimes, for example, Wells Fargo has said that no one can apply if they're not a client before February of 2020. And so a lot of these banks are privileging their existing customers, and even within those existing customers, they're privileging loans to the ones they have the closest rapport with. And so if you're a small business and you haven't startup and you haven't had that opportunity to build a deep relationship, you're at a disadvantage. And I understand that, but our office can help. I mean, if you are in my district and you reach out to our office, we will try to find the way that you can get those resources. It's not first come, first serve. It's supposed to go to every single small business who meets the criteria.
Great. So I think you already preempted and answered the next question, which was, how do we ensure that there's oversight as to how these banks are processing the applicants? And I think this is on lots of people's minds: is are they going to be prejudiced towards their better customers or larger customers versus somebody who may not be a very big depositor with their bank? So
they're not allowed to be. I mean, by law. I mean, they do have discretion on whether they want to participate in the program, and they can have a cutoff in terms of having existing customers, but they can't be discriminatory, obviously. And we are trying to conduct that oversight with SBA, and SBA is trying to conduct that oversight with the banks. But if you have a concrete complaint or you feel like you've been treated unfairly, you can contact my office, or if you're in a different district, your congressperson's office, to take that up with the SBA and to look into it.
Great, thank you. Another question we have is contractors versus full-time employees. Would what we pay contractors, would that be covered by the PPP, or are contractors excluded? Okay.
No, contractors are covered. So if you have a consultant who you're doing, who's doing work for you and you want to pay them, or you have someone who's doing part-time work and in some way as a software programmer but not an employee, you can use the money to cover independent contractors.
Great. Can you talk a little bit about affiliation rules? There's a lot of talk about that, and people are not quite sure what that means. And I know that you have spearheaded a lot of efforts in fixing some of those issues there. Can you talk a little bit about what these affiliation rules are?
Well, the affiliation rule, which was archaic in my judgment, has said that if you are a startup and you have a venture capital equity investor, then technically you may be affiliated with every other startup that venture capitalist has invested in. So BJ, if you invested in my company and you invested in 10 other companies, then for the 500-person rule, I have to count not just my company's employees, but all of the other companies that you have invested in. And we said that that's way too broad. It doesn't understand how Silicon Valley works. Venture capitalists invest in hundreds of companies. Many of them are unrelated. They're not all connected. And just because a venture capitalist invests in a startup doesn't mean they're actually controlling the startup. So what we have called for is a bright line rule. We've said, look, we understand if a venture capitalist owns more than 50% of the company, we understand that that's control. But if it's below a certain threshold, you can call it 30%, you can call it 40%, then there should be a safe harbor and automatically a conclusion that there is no affiliation. We haven't gotten that bright line rule, but we have gotten clarification that if a venture capitalist is less than 50% into a company, and if they can't overturn the board of directors, and if they can't prevent quorum, then a company can qualify. And here's the important point. A company can make that decision today to change any structure, clarify a structure that a venture capitalist is not controlling, and then apply. So it doesn't have to be something that has been on the books. So many companies are saying, okay, we're going to clarify that our venture capitalists who have funded us don't have any control over the board. They can't override board of directors decisions, and they can't prevent a quorum from taking place. And they've actually included that in the bylaws, and that should give them quite a lot of confidence that they would qualify without the affiliation rules.
Great, thank you. Another question is about smaller entities. So these could be sole proprietors or people who are running really tiny companies. So it could be an independent contractor who could be working on his own. Would he or she then qualify for some kind of help during the time that he doesn't have business?
Yes, absolutely. The key criteria is, are you employing people? So if they're employing people and they're a small business or an independently owned, independent sole proprietorship, but they're employing people, then they could qualify. I mean, someone had asked, well, can you qualify if you're having a nanny or house care, and that doesn't qualify them. They've made it very clear that you can't, as a person who's employing nannies or gardeners or things to do with your family or housework, that's not a business. But if it's a real business, if it's a business in any form, then you can qualify.
Now, Congressman Khanna, you could also have a business where you're an independent contractor, right? You're just one person and that's your business. And so you could be consulting or contracting just by yourself without hiring employees. What do these sort of people do if they don't have employees?
Yeah, well, you may still be able to qualify for the Paycheck Protection program. I mean, you would have to apply. You'd have to show that that's your business. And I think that then you'd have to make a determination between whether you would want to go on unemployment, which is quite generous, almost $1,000 a week with the federal program, or whether it makes more sense to apply for a small business loan. And you could ask the SBA or our office or a congressional office in terms of what makes more sense.
Great, thank you. Another question I've gotten is that there's this 100K cap that people are concerned about, and particularly in your district and here in Silicon Valley, I think a lot of people make more than 100K a year. Yeah. So would that disqualify them from these benefits?
No, the 100K cap, and it's important to understand that, is just that the Paycheck Protection program can only be used for the first 100,000. So, BJ, if you were making, let's say, $200,000 as an engineer, and the company got a loan, they could pay your first 100,000 of salary based on that loan. They just can't pay above the 100,000. So it can cover, even if someone's making $1 million, it can cover the first 100,000. But if all your employees are making over 100,000, you still can qualify for the loan. You just have to disperse it to make sure that you're covering the first 100,000 for all of those employees.
Now, is it 100,000 per employee or 100,000 in total?
Per employee. You can pay. You can cover up to the first 100,000 for an employee.
Great. I think that's really good. At this point, AGK, I'm going to switch over to you so you could address some of the questions coming in online.
Yeah, Congressman, I have a question related to the joint efforts that Apple and Google had come out with for this tracing and tracking. In your opinion, how can small startup, especially technology startups, participate in this effort to make this easier as COVID crisis sustains over the months and years to come?
Well, AGK, I appreciate that. I've been in touch with both Apple and Google, and I think they're doing an extraordinary service by trying to team up to come up with this app. Obviously they understand the privacy concerns, and so they're going to make sure that any data is anonymized. They're going to make sure people are opting in. But by having strong privacy, we run the risk of having less adoption. So I think one of the things we're going to need is very creative strategies for adoption. How do we actually adopt, get people to volunteer to put this information on an app if they're COVID positive, and knowing that it's going to be anonymized, knowing that they're not going to have personal information on, people still will be reluctant. And I think that if there are people who are doing creative work on how to get adoption of that app, that's probably an area that they can collaborate with.
Is there any incentives that government can do for this broader participation? Because it could be crowdsourced, essentially the entire community benefits from that, right? Is there anything that can be done by?
No, it's a great question. I mean, so far the government has not provided direct funding for technological solutions to the COVID crisis. It's been more small businesses in general. It's been more broad-based, but I certainly would support the creation of a fund to help companies who are innovating in this space, but that the government hasn't done that so far.
Yeah, I mean, as we know, there's a lot of research and development funding, like small business innovation research, like the SBIR as well as the STTR with the university collaboration. Is this coming from the Office of the President and or the respective departments, or it would be some sort of a congressional effort for
It would
giving?
require both. It would require both. It would require congressional effort. Now, it could be that the president says to SBIR, prioritize loans or funding for those companies in this space of tackling COVID. They could say that to NIH. They could say that to CDC grants. But we could have an additional congressional authorization to SBA or NIH saying fund innovative work that's tackling the COVID crisis. And I think that would make sense, and it's a policy I will support.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, the other question that I have is related to the U.S.-China relationship, right? I mean, there is there's a lot of talk about blaming Chinese community, and I have a lot of colleagues right in the Bay Area. How do you think the relationship, especially because a lot of Chinese supply chain relationship dependencies there, do you see further challenges with respect to China, US, these type of supply chain related issues? Any comments?
Well, I appreciate that, Ikeji. I think we have to make sure that we don't have xenophobia or hate or stereotyping first against the Asian American community, Chinese American community here in the U.S. We've seen how interdependent the global economy is with this crisis. We need to make sure that we're not undermining those critical trade relationships that are putting more pressure on American businesses at a time of crisis. But I do think we need to have reform. I mean, there's no doubt that the Chinese government was not transparent about the pandemic, that they did not inform the World Health Organization or the United States. In fact, the trade deal they did with us, they said we may not, but we get to get out of our buying arrangement if there is a pandemic. So they obviously knew something was in the works, and they hadn't been transparent. And I think we have to push in the bilateral negotiation, insist that they need to have more transparency in future dealings when they have these kind of health crises.
Okay. Excellent. The other questions that I see here is that many companies have applied for this, including our company, where the PPP application has been sent, but most of the banks have acknowledged the application, and they say that they'll have to go through their own diligence. I think BJ talked about it earlier, and you answered also. Is there a way, one can get an idea as to when they can actually get the money, or when will the distribution happen?
Well, we're pushing for as fast as possible. I mean, this is what I'm saying to the administration. They should consider Square or Stripe or other technology vendors that could help facilitate this process to getting money out to the businesses that need them, because every day that the businesses don't have money is someone else getting laid off, someone else's salary being reduced, someone's hours being reduced. I believe the process is going to take weeks, not months, but even weeks could be too long. I understand the frustration. I know the administration, we're putting pressure on the administration to increase the amount of banks that could qualify and distribute this. But there's a recognition that the money isn't getting out fast enough.
Okay. And there are other questions that, related to this government funding where, there's some requirements that any companies who have been in existence prior to February 15th, and they had a trailing 12 months operation or a pro rata. What happens to companies that got started right after the February 15th cutoff? Will they get any kind of support? What will happen to those businesses? Because in the Valley, as you know, lots and lots of companies get created and who may have recently hired contractors or employees.
Yeah, I think there may be, I think if it's close to the deadline, SBA always has some discretion, and it doesn't hurt to make the case. But in this stimulus, it will be tough if it's far away from the deadline. If it was started in March, and I think then there's other programs, unemployment assistance, but I think it may have to wait for the next year of funding, which is not a helpful thing. But I don't think there will be an appetite to move that date.
Okay. And this is a question that came in from one of the participants. Can the EIDL loan be used to make mortgage payments on small business loan? It doesn't seem to be permitted for PPP.
That's something you would have to consult your lawyer. I don't want to be, in getting into such micro issues and giving legal advice. But I would just say that, that's something the SBA, you could ask your SBA a loan officer or any counsel about what is and isn't permitted with these loans.
Okay. This is another question related to, I think we addressed it, but maybe bring that up again with respect to if you are an independent consultant who's doing traditionally consulting business and that cannot happen due to travel restrictions and all right now, how do we, are there options other than just unemployment insurance, for such scenario, especially if you take a look at the last year's tax return or something like that, they may not qualify for anything based on the current criteria.
Well, they certainly would qualify for unemployment insurance if they've lost their jobs or lost their hours.
Yeah. I mean, the question was besides unemployment insurance.
Besides unemployment, they would qualify for the Paycheck Protection if they can show that their business has been hit and that they need that loan for self-payroll. There's no restriction on, as I understand it, of just having a sole proprietorship or one person independent contractor. But they would have to then make that case to the SBA that they're using it for their own salary. Of course, it could be only up to 100,000 and up to eight weeks.
Okay.
BJ, I'll take a few questions
Yeah,
now.
please. Yeah, I'm just looking for more questions, BJ. Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. So some of the questions I've gotten here, Ro, is around H-1B employees, and a fair number of people in the Silicon Valley, are engineers, etc., who are on H-1Bs. Would their immigration status jeopardize their ability to keep contributing to our economy? Can they benefit from some of these programs?
Well, the H-1B visa program doesn't qualify for the federal assistance, but obviously and I understand that they're in a difficult situation, and if there are particular immigration status questions, that they can contact our office, and we can try to be of help. But a company can't use the federal resources to pay an H-1B worker.
And that's actually a fair number in the Valley, right? So I think those people will be negatively impacted. Yeah. All right, let's see. Some of the other questions is, the question is, since there is really no visibility on when the PPP will actually come, given that there are, a million applications and, it could take weeks, it could take some months, how do business owners or, managers determine whether they should furlough or let their employees go now versus wait the 2 months and then find out they didn't get any money or loan?
It's a very difficult situation, and I understand it. I sympathize with it. I understand that people are having to make these decisions every day. This is why many of us in Congress are pushing to say, get this money out now, get it out as fast as possible. Don't be so caught up in, does it meet every criteria? We need to push the money out to save jobs and to stimulate the economy. But there's nothing I can say to that other than that we're pushing to get the money out as fast as possible.
Okay. So BJ, I have a question. Can I ask BJ?
Please go for it.
So the there are a lot of not-for-profit organizations in the Valley, and they have paid employees, right? And as those nonprofits are not able to generate income, how can they survive, and what kind of suggestions do you have for such organizations?
Well, I appreciate nonprofits qualify for this small business loan. They qualify for the Paycheck Protection program. So I would encourage them to apply for these programs. They would get the 8 weeks of payroll paid. In some cases, they can get a loan up to paying 6 months of payroll. And the nonprofits, just like startups or small businesses, qualify for all of these programs. And I'd encourage them to take advantage of that.
Okay, and along the same line, are there options, because most of these nonprofits may or may not, maybe in rental facilities and things like that, what kind of rent abatement or anything like that that they could, is that something between them and the respective landlords, or there is any local or federal government protection there?
This is the issue of that you can't get evicted, which is the case. I mean, you certainly currently can't get evicted for the next 3 months. There's a moratorium on that. But in terms of getting rental assistance, we haven't had that at the federal level yet. Some cities provide some marginal amount, but I'm pushing that we get rental assistance for individuals who need it, and startup and small businesses and nonprofits, and we'll see if we can get that in the next stimulus bill.
Okay, and this is coming from another maybe property owner's perspective, right? So one could be a property owner in the valley, either for commercial or for residential purposes, and then their tenants are not able to pay rent, but the owners themselves have to make their mortgage payments. Again, that kind of support, will SBA or any other loans support tiding over this period?
Let's say that again.
So it's really, let's say if you're a property owner and then you have tenants who are not paying rent, but the property owner has to continue to pay the mortgage. And so it's, they're running it almost like a business.
Yeah, so they can qualify for the small business loans as well if you're a landlord property owner. This is why I don't think the federal government can just say, okay, don't pay rent. They have to provide rental assistance, because a lot of these small businesses are the landlords often, and they would be driven out of business if we just said, okay, stop paying mortgage or stop paying rent. It's not just the big banks that are the mortgage holders or the big real estate companies. So I'm pushing for federal assistance. But in the meantime, if a small business is not getting sufficient revenue because people aren't paying their rent, then you can qualify for the small business loan.
Okay. So I have some other questions. I mean, specifically it says, Secretary Scalia is trying to add restriction to worker stimulus benefits, and President Trump said he will not heed oversight. Can Congress force compliance?
Well, we need to make sure that the bailouts are going to helping workers. I mean, in Canada, you had 75% of a person's salary being paid. In Britain, 80%. The question to be asked is, why were these companies, multi-billion-dollar companies, sitting there without the reserve funds to have 1 or 2 months of payroll? I mean, it was, in my view, financial mismanagement that they were engaged in stock buybacks and other aggressive financial plays, but didn't have a basic set aside for 2 months, 3 months of payroll. So we need to make sure, if they're coming to the federal government and taxpayers for assistance, that they are using that money to keep people employed and for workers, and not mismanaging those resources.
Okay. B.J., I'll look for more questions.
Yeah. So Congressman Khanna, one of the things that people are concerned about is if they are, if they have offshore or foreign development centers, right? So if somebody has a development center in Asia, so how will this impact them, if at all? If they have development centers offshore, would that come?
This stimulus does not apply in any way to anything offshore or anything that's not being done in the United States. So they can consider bringing it back, or it's not it doesn't cover any facility outside the United States.
Got it. No, but it doesn't preclude the people who are in the United States, but who have development centers offshore, right? That shouldn't really matter.
No. If they're employed in the United States, and if they have some development center outside, that does not disqualify them for getting loans to pay the people who are doing the work here in the United States.
Got it.
I had another question that's directed to Congress. It says, is Congress going to bail out the USPS and remove the oppressive requirement that they fully fund future pension liabilities?
I think the Congress does have to help with the United States Postal Service. It's a critical function. We've seen how critical it is in this crisis, and we need to fully fund it. And we need to make sure that Congress is helping with the funding of the pension liabilities, as opposed to leaving that on a particular agency, which the U.S. Postal Service will be unable to meet without congressional aid.
Okay.
So I have a question which just came in here. It says, if they have already cut back on employee hours, would they still qualify for the PPP, or would that disqualify them?
Yes, no, they do. They do. I mean, the idea is that they have to show that those cuts were because of the COVID crisis, and they need to show that the money is going to go to prevent further cuts or to bring back the people they had cut. But they absolutely, if they've already furloughed or laid off because of this crisis, they still qualify.
Got it.
The other question is there any plan to extend the PPP loan forgiveness beyond the 8 weeks provided in the program? Economy will not magically bounce back after 8 weeks.
It's a good question. So far, no. I think because there's so much demand for the program, I think the bigger issue is, will the government meet all of the people who need the loans? I could see maybe if depending on where the economy is in June or July, that the Congress tries to do another round of stimulus if it's needed. But I think there's a higher likelihood that the money will expand to make sure everyone can qualify for the 8 weeks. I don't think anytime in the near future it's likely to extend beyond 8 weeks.
Okay. Another question. It says, is there a plan to fund the EIDL grant of $10K beyond the $10 billion in the CARES Act? There are already over 3 million requests for over 30 billion allocated.
Yeah, there is. I mean, that will be part of the negotiation with the next round of funding for small business. I mean, we're talking about $250 billion, and I think there is a proposal there also for EIDL funding increase, and I'm pretty confident we will get some funding increase on that.
Congressman, while AJK, are you ready?
Yeah, I have another question. This is regarding the funds that are supported through the CARES Act, right? You know, how are we ensuring that there is no fraud or waste or abuse, right? I mean, so what kind of checks and balances does Congress?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's difficult. Obviously, we're putting it in a large amount of money, $350 billion, very quickly. The SBA is swamped. A lot of it is going to be the front line, is going to be the banks. They understand that they have to be the first check, and they can't be processing or submitting applications that are fraudulent. And then I think SBA will do a check at the end. And if they find that there was willful fraud, of course, there could be criminal penalties. But if they find that there was fraud that was well-intentioned, or just judgments that were wrong, then they'll require the full payment of the loan back. So that will be it. You know, the SBA will assess. So, you know, if people shouldn't think that they should commit fraud, it's a very high consequence. I mean, you could go to jail if it's blatant. And if they're interpreting things that are not in good faith, then you just would end up having to pay back the loan.
Okay. B.J.?
Yeah, so Congressman, can you sort of educate our viewers a little bit about what exactly is it that your office does and what sort of resources that you have on your team to help people in your constituency?
I appreciate that. Well, we can help at all. Certainly, if there's someone who's looking to have unemployment insurance. Yesterday, we spent 3 hours with a constituent because the website was down. They weren't being able to get their unemployment. We can help if someone isn't getting their cash stimulus checks, which everyone should be getting in the next 2 weeks if you make under 150,000. We can help with the small business loans process. So contact us if there's some glitch in the process, if you're not getting responses, if you're not figuring out the application. We can facilitate all of that. And then, of course, we can help on immigration issues that people are facing.
Can you provide us with some contact information for people on your team, or how would people reach out to you?
I mean, just my website. It's the House website, www.house.gov/Rep Ro Khanna. If you go Google it, Ro Khanna, you'll get, it's the first website that pops up, and we have a form there, and we're very good. We get back to people within 24 hours on any inquiry.
That's very impressive. Thank you.
Yeah, I have another question. As people are sheltered in place with, young kids at home, college students, and what kind of volunteering opportunities are there as the entire community, especially your constituency, right? What can they do in terms of volunteering? And do you see how people can sign up to those if there are opportunities?
That's a great question, and a very thoughtful question. I mean, there are still certain places that are doing food banks where they're serving food, and they're keeping social distancing, but they're serving food for those who need it. And certainly people, if they want to venture out, can do that. If they want to stay inside, there are places that could use educational tutors, people for online learning. There are places, I think you could be a counselor, a source of just community strength. I mean, as people are lonely, as they don't have many people to communicate with. And I think just on an individual basis, you should be, I check in more with my parents, with my friends. People can be checking in on community members and showing concern at a time that people feel lonely and isolated. But it's an excellent question. If we come across organizations that are doing virtual volunteer work, we'll send those recommendations.
Yeah, it would be great if you could, outline them in your, in your website or something like that, a place, because not everybody knows all the opportunities out there to volunteer. So
yeah, no, that's a great idea. We'll certainly know the places on food banks and places like that are open, but we'll also look for some of the volunteer organizations that are remote.
Okay. BJ, I'll scroll through the other things, BJ, if you have more questions.
Sure. While you're doing that, so Congressman, one of the things I'm sure you fielded questions from many other constituents as well. Are there things that we missed out, which were probably important questions? Is there stuff that you could proactively educate our viewers on?
Yeah, well, I think that the big concern for California is federal funding for the states and for the cities, because our budget is going to be so hard hit with the decline of tax revenue. And our cities are going to be very hard hit. And so what does this mean for school funding? What does this mean for police, for fire, for all of the things that the state funds? And I've been pushing for the next stimulus to make sure that we get federal funding for states and cities in this crisis, and that it doesn't have the provision it did last time that cities under 500,000 don't qualify. Most of the cities in Silicon Valley, unless you live in San Jose, are under 500,000. Fremont, Cupertino, Sunnyvale, Milpitas, Mountain View, Palo Alto. So we need to make sure that we're giving funding to the cities and states. The second thing I'd say is we got to have mass testing. I was on the phone before this with all the mayors of our city. I'm glad that Milpitas apparently is going to have a mass testing available starting the end of this week, and they're going to be doing this at a sports location there. If it works, I think hopefully it'll get adopted more broadly. That's the key to getting our economy started again in the Bay Area. We need mass testing and being able to have a confidence of people going to work and getting this testing. So those are two things that often come up. In terms of when can we start, I think that's anyone's guess. My hope is we're past the worst of it, and Santa Clara, we've done a great job with Dr. Cody and others in sheltering in place and really been compliant. I appreciate how compliant people have been. I hope things will start to turn around come mid-May.
Yeah, there's another follow-on question there. You mentioned mass testing. Can you define that for the listeners, please?
Yeah. Well, the way the mayor of Milpitas was saying is that there would be a location that people could go drive to and get tested, and you didn't need to have symptoms. It would just be tests available to anyone driving there. And so that's ultimately what we have to get to, the sense that anyone who wants to get tested, or feels they've been exposed, or feels that they have even the slightest symptoms, can go and get tested. And I think as we get mass testing, as we get these antibody tests, that's what's going to allow us to start to get back to normal.
Okay, this is.
I also want to mention that the strong partnership, of course, with India dealing with COVID, and how critical that's been. I've been in touch with the Indian ambassador, and our scientists are cooperating on coming up with vaccine developments and antiviral developments. We have been working to really push the boundaries on innovation for vaccines and antivirals, and that partnership has been a source of great strength.
Okay, another question is related to the H-1B workers, right? So as you know, when an H-1B employee is loses a job or terminated, then they have a finite period, like 60 days or something, to find another job. Is there a way, given the circumstances, will there be a grace period, or how, if that's not possible, how can they return or whatever, right? Because they'll be essentially stranded, right? They are.
Yeah, no, I understand that, and it's a tough situation, especially for people who have kids here and who have gone to schools here. There's not going to be a grace period for that, especially under this administration, given their attitude towards immigration. But if there's a case of particularly humanitarian circumstances, or circumstances that you think merits consideration, you can reach out to any congressional office where you're living, and the member of Congress can at least help present your case to the immigration deciding officer.
Okay. And also, the questions you mentioned that the H-1B employees, will they be covered under the PPP or not?
No, they won't.
They won't be covered under the PPP.
No.
Okay. And if that is the case, then will the green card holders who are permanent residents of the United States, will they be?
They will be covered. They will be covered.
Okay. Then the other one is the question related to how will SBA determine the EIDL loan amount, especially if it's based on revenue and cost of operation. There could be a lot of startups who don't have any revenue, and how do they qualify for that?
Well, I think in that case, if they have absolutely no revenue, I think they would look to what the costs are, what the business operating costs are, what the damage has been to payroll. I mean, the big criteria is how many people are you employing, and how can we keep those jobs from being lost. So I think that's what they will look at. The more people you're employing, the more you can show that money is going to be used to keep people employed. I think that's really what is relevant. So if you have a very few people employed, they'll be less sympathetic than if you have a lot of people employed.
Okay.
Congressman Khanna, one of the things that we realized during this crisis is how dependent we were on countries like China for everything as simple as surgical masks to ventilators, etc. So do you foresee that some of these industries will come back to the US? And if so, would you be making some kind of push in Congress to try, and because these could also be employment opportunities for Americans?
Absolutely, BJ. Well, you may remember I wrote a book in 2012 about why manufacturing is critical to America's future entrepreneurial nation. And I talked then about how we need to have critical manufacturing in the United States, when it comes to our national defense, when it comes to our health security, when it comes to our financial security. And there's a growing chorus in Congress that we do need to have some of these critical supplies here. I mean, China is our third largest supplier of medical equipment. We are very dependent on the global supply chain. And it also is a cautionary tale. I mean, the president, when he says, oh, we only have 4% or something of our exports to China, 4% of GDP is Chinese exports, or even less, is not sufficiently appreciating the importance of the global supply chain. So I think the lesson is we got to have critical manufacturing in the United States, but we also need to understand that you can't have massive disruptions to global trade, that the disruptions of global supply chains really hurt companies.
Thank you.
The other question is related to the, are you keeping an eye or on some sort of data on how the hospital system in the Valley is coping up with this? What percentage of hospital beds are occupied? Are we prepared? Should things, right now, things
Yes.
seem to flatten, but what is your take on the occupancy at these hospitals?
Well, I appreciate it. I have a regular conference call with the mayors, and I'm in regular touch with Dr. Cody, of course, the Santa Clara Public Health Officer, and with people in Alameda County and so forth. It's good news. I mean, we are very well prepared. The cases haven't exceeded, have actually been less than what the worst case scenarios were. The sheltering in place is working. The concern is, okay, as we ease these restrictions, will we see a spike, or do we see a second wave? And we have to be vigilant. But the more time we have, I mean, these hospitals have really increased their capacity. We still have to tackle the homelessness issue, and there are large homeless encampments, particularly in Cupertino, other places that I think are a risk of spreading the infection and overwhelming our hospitals. But so far, we've had very good success. I think the biggest complaint I'm hearing from the hospitals is testing. They're not getting the testing fast enough and accessible enough. And there's still certain concerns about protective equipment, that they don't have enough protective equipment.
Okay. This is another interesting question, because you said you had mentioned to the Indian, you discussed with the Indian ambassador, what about, India right now, because of the entire country being shut down, is also requiring a lot of food grains. Is there an opportunity to, from US to India, to support this particular, food shortage issues in India? Food supply
Absolutely.
chain.
I mean, I think we should be supporting that. I think it'll strengthen our relationship, and it could be an export opportunity also in terms of relationships for some of our farmers. So that's the type of win-win relationship, and I will certainly bring that up next time with the ambassador and with the administration. But I've, as you know, believe that the U.S.-India relationship is absolutely essential to the 21st century. The relationship in science collaboration. Of course, we have a very strong defense relationship, as I know, because I sit on the Armed Services Committee, and we need to keep deepening ties between these countries, which are both entrepreneurial, both are liberal democracies.
Congressman Khanna, do you have a sense of when the shelter in place is going to relax, and when can people start going back to their normal lives?
I don't. It's funny because my wife always says that they ask her when these things are going to end, as if she has some inside knowledge or authority, and she says, no, I'm the last one to know. And she was much more right about this whole crisis than I was. She was telling us months ago we should have been sheltering in place and getting groceries. I don't have any knowledge or guess better than the people on this call. I would just say that we should be proud that Santa Clara County has been working. The shelter in place is working. The numbers are coming down. I had an op-ed that I highly recommend. Maybe people can share it. It was in the San Francisco Chronicle, where I said our decision to shelter in place was the first in the country. And the former CDC head said if Cuomo in New York had done the same thing, deaths in New York would have been 80% less. If the governor had done the same thing statewide, we would have seen far less cases in LA and other hotspots. So we should be very proud of what we've done in Santa Clara County and Alameda County. It's not because of my leadership, it's because of the leadership of a lot of the local officials listening to science. Doesn't surprise me that Silicon Valley, we would listen to the science and the data, but we have. And I think we have to continue to listen to the science and the data. And certainly I will be advocating based on what Dr. Cody and the scientists and the health officials tell us.
Yeah, I mean, the leadership of the states, right, Governor Gavin Newsom and governors of Washington and Oregon are also talking about relaxing the shelter at home. But given that we don't have full testing for everyone, is this safe? And in your opinion, what are the logistics involved for giving certificates out? And is it the right thing to do without a cure or a vaccine?
It's a very good point. I mean, look, the worst case scenario for both health and the economy would be to have a second wave of this and then to have to go back and shelter in place all over again. If you look at the Spanish flu, that's exactly what happened. The second wave was much, much worse than it hit in about October in 1918. So, you know, there's no silver bullet. The challenge is how do we relax the standards slowly, but while increasing testing, increasing antibody testing, being very careful, I think, particularly for older folks. And you know, a lot of us have parents in this, in communities, and if you're over 60, you know, you have to really be careful, and we have to encourage our parents to be careful and take this very seriously. So I could see sort of people going back to work, we're not at risk, then having some mass more testing. But I think this is going to have to be a gradual process. It's not going to be everyone on ramping back to work and going back to normal. And I think it may take a year before we really are fully back to normal, where we have a vaccine. Until then, you know, who knows how many large gatherings will be allowed to take place.
Yeah, along the same line, right, as the governors of different states are coordinating this, right, are there any specific strategies to prevent hotspots, you know, from migrating from one state to another when things have opened up or when things open up? And then what's the national strategy to mitigate that? Are you aware of anything being done to go from one state to another?
Well, it's very challenging because we can't infringe on an American's right to go from one state to another. I mean, the president, I think, could have shut down airlines more from hotspots and should have done that probably months ago, but I'm not sure doing that now makes sense. I think the question will be, can we still have guidelines saying, well, recommendations, don't travel if you're in a hotspot unless it's absolutely essential. Be reluctant still to get on airplanes and travel unless it's essential. I think we have to ease into this. But our country, you know, we have personal freedoms. We don't have everyone tracked and you know, quarantined mandatorily and forced to tell everyone they've talked to because of our freedoms. And the challenge is we can't be Singapore or South Korea or China as a result of that. But I wouldn't want their model of government. Where I think we have failed is that we should have had much earlier testing for everyone, and we were unprepared. We should have had far more investment in the vaccines on coronavirus, and we were unprepared. And that's where I think we need to do better. I mean, look, I wish Bill Gates for at least 6 months. I don't agree with him on everything, but I wish he were president. I mean, he predicted a lot of this back in 2015. And so I think hopefully one of the lessons for this is that we need to listen to the scientists, and we need to listen to people like Gates who dedicated their life understanding infectious disease and be better prepared for this next time.
Yeah. Then the other question related to U.S. citizens stuck overseas, or, you know, what, if any, are being done to bring back those people? Recently, I saw a press article where even though there are, you know, a large number of U.S. citizens stuck in India, but very few wanted to come back. What's your, I don't know if you've seen that.
Well, first of all, I guess depending on where you are, it's not clear to me that coming back is going to be in your, make you more safe. I mean, I get that, but I get that people have family and there's a concern there. We need to make sure that we are prioritizing American citizens coming back. And people have reached out to our office who've been caught overseas, and we've tried to help them in figuring out the route they could take that would be a legal way of coming back. It may be inconvenient. They may have to quarantine for a while. They may have to get tested. But we and other members of Congress are trying to work to help get our citizens back. But what I would say is, people should be reasonable about it, rational about it, and see, are they more safe staying where they are right now versus risking the travel and catching something based on travel. Again, if it's a necessity, if you have a young son or daughter or elderly parent and you feel like you have to come back for family reasons or health reasons, I understand that. But I think all of us are better off the less we are exposed right now and the less we're traveling.
Okay. One other question related to small businesses, right? So what can small businesses do when it comes to getting their employees tested? Is there any suggestions there?
Yeah, right now we just don't have tests. I mean, if there were tests, what we really need is tests widely available. You go to a Walgreens, you go to a CVS, you can, just like you get the flu shot, you can go get a test, right? And that's what we have to work towards. That's when we will start to see some return to normalcy. But right now, the small businesses can't do much because even the hospitals are having a tough time getting tests.
Okay. So BJ, I think we are running out of time. I can still look for questions, but we are only 3 minutes. I don't know how much, there are still, I can scroll for more questions here. I see more. I'll let you comment on it. We are only 3 minutes to go, but in the meanwhile, I'll look for it based on what you both say.
Yeah, I think what we'll do here is, we're at the top of the hour. And so Congressman Khanna, thank you so much for taking the time. If there are follow-on questions, I will forward them on to Cooper or somebody else on your team, and then we can try and address them offline. Yeah.
Well, BJ,
thank you again for everything. Of course, thank you for everything you do for our community, and appreciate your leadership.
Well, thank you, BJ. Thank you for your incredible leadership with TiE, and thank you to AGK. I often say that I have been so blessed in my generation. I was born in Philadelphia. My parents came here in the 1960s. But when I started my political journey back in 2004, very few people believed in me other than the TiE entrepreneurs. And then they kept believing in me even after I lost, because they understand risk and being entrepreneurial. And I am so incredibly proud, particularly of the Indian American community and our leadership in technology in so many places, and what we're doing now for this country. And it's just a great honor to be able to represent Silicon Valley and to have had this conversation with TiE, which is, I believe, at the real foundation of everything in Silicon Valley. So thank you for your leadership, and thank you for TiE's leadership over the many decades since 2000, or since it was founded.
Great.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I think, yeah.
Great. Thank you. We'll be in touch.
Yeah.
Thank you, our viewers.